Why are all composite things ultimately held together? Let's consider. Hello, philosophers. I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Show, where we consider the greatest questions of human history. Does God exist? Big question. I'm going to look at today an argument first given by a philosopher named Plotinus, ancient philosopher, and very recently developed by another philosopher named Edward Feser. So he calls it the Neoplatonian argument. I'm going to call it the argument from composition. It goes something like this. First, the things of our experience are all composed. They're all made up of parts. My shirt is made up of parts. My hat is made up of parts. I am made up of parts. My book back here is made up of parts. In fact, this is the book that I got this argument out of, 5 Proofs for the Existence of God. But what is the relation of the whole to its parts? What is the relation of, let's say, the pages and the cover of this book to the whole book, to the composite? It seems like the composite depends for its existence on the parts, right? It's only if the parts exist themselves and are arranged a particular way that the book can exist in the first place. The papers have got to be there, and they've got to be, folded the right way, and they've got to be put together, and the cover's got to be around it, and then we have a book. Otherwise, we just don't have a book. Now, that can be confusing because that might seem like I'm talking about a chronological type of dependence, right? Like I'm talking about first the pages and the cover exist, and then the book exists, and that's the kind of dependence we're talking about. Feser gives another example of a non-chronological dependence, which is the human body. So the human body's parts, let's say, are the cells, the human cells. Now, the body develops with the cells developing as well. So there's no point in time where the cells are existing and then you gather them all together and you put together a human body, right? The human body and the human cells exist at only the same times. So there's a different kind of dependence that we're talking about here. We could say this is an ontological type of dependence rather than a chronological type of dependence. So the composite depends ontologically for its existence on its parts. But then we have the further question. The pages are put together a particular way. What makes it that way? We know the glue sticks the pages together. There's also string in there. I always wonder, do they sew it together? I don't know how they bind books, but I'm always curious. So they put them together using other parts, and there's got to be somebody to put it together, right? And there've got to be certain conditions, like Feser points out, like it can't get over a certain temperature or else the book will catch on fire and the different parts won't be put together anymore. They'll just be ashes. So there are, in other words, causes for the parts to both exist and to be arranged in a particular way. So the question is, what could be those causes? Well, I'll tell you one thing it can't be. It can't be the composite itself, right? The book can't cause the parts. The book itself can't cause the parts of the book to come together and to exist. Otherwise, it's like we would have a vicious circle there, right? We would have the book causing the parts and the parts causing the book, and everything's causing itself. And how is causation even possible in that way? So that would be a vicious circle. That doesn't make any sense. But it also, if we were to posit some other composite thing that caused these parts to come together, right? Something else with parts. We could do that. In fact, likely that's what happens. Something else with parts causes these parts to come together. But then we have the question about that something else. What causes its parts to come together and to exist and to be arranged in such a way? And we could posit another composite thing and say, well, it's that thing caused it. But then, of course, we have the question for that thing, right? And at each time, the composite doesn't exist unless the parts exist and are arranged in a particular way. Remember, this is an ontological type of dependence. So if all we have is a bunch of composites that are all causing each other to have, their parts in a particular way, then actually we never get those parts caused, because no composite actually exists. Nothing ever gets its parts put together into the composite, because everything is always depending upon the guy next to it, which is depending upon the guy next to it, and nobody comes to be, right? Nobody comes to exist. So the argument goes, there must be something that exists that is wholly without parts, totally without parts, completely simple. There must be an original cause that is a simple cause. Now, you may think to yourself, great, the original cause has to be simple. I've got a few possibilities here on what could be simple things. But unfortunately, we can't have a few simple things. We can only have one simple thing. And why is that? Consider how two things could be different. One would have to have a feature that the other one lacks. Now, if this first thing has a feature, then that means it is actually a composite thing. It is a thing plus this feature that it has. So it is not simple. Only the second thing could be simple. So we can't actually have two simple things, because then one of them at least has got to be complex. So everything must be caused by one simple cause, and this we call God. Now, I realize some of you guys are going to think at this point, well, this doesn't sound like God just yet. All you've told me is that this is a radically simple kind of a thing. You haven't told me it's all knowing or all good or anything like that. Don't worry, much like I said for the argument from change, I will get to the different attributes of God. But right now, I want to address one confusion you may have had, which is you may have thought, oh, a simple cause, particles, subatomic particles, right? They're not made up of parts, so they're simple. Well, obviously, we've just seen how there can only be one radically simple cause. So what gives with the particles? Well, the particles may not have material parts, but they do have metaphysical parts. And what do I mean by that? I mean that they have different properties that are all separate from each other, that are not identical to the whole. So, for example, the charge of an electron is different from the mass of an electron, two different things. Or the existence of a thing is different from the essence of a thing, right? What an electron is distinct from the fact that it is. In fact, there are many electrons, so they all have the same what, they all have the same essence, but they're all different existences. In that sense, they have metaphysical parts, but these metaphysical parts, we should better call them principles, because they're not like standard material parts where you could take them apart and they could exist apart from the composite. Instead, these are things that you couldn't split apart without just annihilating everything. So, for example, there is no essence of electron waiting for an existence to come by and complete it, and now we have an electron show, right? That doesn't make any sense. The electron is a composite, if you will, of essence and existence. But essence and existence aren't two substances that get together and form an electron, or the charge of an electron and the mass of an electron, right? Those are two different things, two separate things, but it's not like you could separate them, right? Those two things exist as a whole in the electron, but they're different things. So these are metaphysical parts where we could call principles, like I say, because they aren't like regular parts. But still, it shows that these things, these particles, are not radically simple like we're talking about. These are composites in a sense, in a deep sense, right? In an ontological sense. The only thing then that we would say is radically simple is something that doesn't have properties that are distinct from what it is, right? That the properties are not distinct from each other and are not distinct from the thing, or whose essence is not distinct from its existence, right? Whose essence is to exist, is existence itself. And this radically simple thing, of course, we would call God. Now, this is a doctrine called divine simplicity that in a future episode we're going to talk about. Not all theists believe in divine simplicity, but if you buy this argument, then you do. And I'll have a video on divine simplicity because they're huge questions, right? Like, how is it the case that the properties of God are not distinct from each other? You know, like, isn't God's goodness different from his power, and his power different from his intellect? How do you make sense out of that? So we'll talk about that in a future video. There are a few objections that Feser goes through in the end, including, couldn't it be the case that it's just a law of nature that these things are composed? The way he responds, well, first of all, I could say that a law of nature is either real or not real. And some philosophers think that it's not real. So some philosophers think it's just a mathematical description of what tends to happen. And if that's the case, then a law of nature is not causal in any way, and then it doesn't explain why there's that composition in the first place. So it's no kind of explanation if a law of nature isn't a real thing. And if a law of nature is a real thing, then Feser points out that what you end up having then is a new composite. Let's say we have part A and part B make up a whole, a composite. And when we ask why is that a composite, we say, well, there's a law of nature that combines A and B. Sweet. But why are A and B composed by that specific law of nature rather than some other law of nature? Ultimately, what you have is you have A, B, and law of nature L, let's say. So A, B, and L, which is some new composite. And we have the question, what accounts for the composition of A, B, and L, right? What brings those things together? And so then we have the problem of composition once more. Another possibility is to just say that it's just a brute fact, right? These things just are composed of these parts, and that's it. It's important to note that this is not an explanation in any way, right? To say something is a brute fact is not to explain anything at all. It's just to say that we're not giving an explanation. The trouble is, and Feser gets this argument from this book on Plotinus by Lloyd Garrison? I don't know. Which is that Plotinus gives you a reason, right? In this argument, he gave you a reason of why these things would be composed. You don't get to just say, I guess there's no reason at all, brute fact. If you've been given a reason that explains something, then the only way you get to appeal to a brute fact is if that reason doesn't explain that thing, but seems like it does explain that thing. So we can't just stick our fingers in our ears and say, blah, 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 I'm not listening to you. There is no argument here, right? There is an argument, there is a reason given, and it leads to, this simple creator of all things. So that is maybe unpalatable, but it is something that explains. So that is the argument from composition. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and I will see you in the next video. Adios.